So we want to have each, can I have each of you introduce yourselves? Instead of me, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing, but I would prefer if I didn't get a blurb from each of your companies to do the interviews. I mean, sorry, to do the introduction. So if you could do that, that would be phenomenal.
So, hi everyone. Welcome to the closing panel of day one of Bookstore Romance Day weekend. Thank you all for coming. I am Billy. I am the founder and organizer of Bookstore Romance Day, and I'm gonna shut up in just a minute here. If you have questions, there is a Q&A box. The chat is live if you want it. Closed captioning is available. And with that, I turn it all over to Kathy Burnett, who will be your hostess for the afternoon.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I'm Kathy. I own Brainler Books here in South Bend, Indiana. Our focus is mostly inclusive books. We try to uplift marginalized voices. That's what we say we're doing. I'm so happy to be here, though. My secret love, actually really not secret because we have an entire table up front, is romance novels. Today people had to guess how many I'd read on the table, and there were 43 that I had read. So this is like such an awesome thing that I get to do every year, is to tout like these are the books you should be reading. So I'm really happy to be here. Before we get started, I'm going to have each author introduce themselves, and then I have some questions. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A and we will go from there. So let's start with Renee. You're first on my screen.
Hi, I'm Renee. I'm coming to you from the future. It's Sunday morning here in Australia. I've literally just moved house, so I'm sitting on the floor in an empty room. Hopefully it's not too echoey. I am a bisexual writer. I write romance. I have what they call a complex catalogue. So I write historical and contemporary, and all different pairings. So MF, MM, and Sapphic. Yeah. So not very many in Australia, but a few in Australia, all over the place.
Do you have any advice for us in the future when we get to Sunday?
What's a lovely day here in Australia?
I'm going to go and place a bet and see what I can get from knowing what's going to happen tomorrow. So thank you for that, Renee. All right, LaQuette, you're up.
Hi, I'm LaQuette, and I write sexy, stylish, and sensational romance. What that means is I generally just write Hallmark movies, but with lots of sex. And they generally include a very diverse ensemble cast.
All right, thank you for that. And Karen?
I also write sexy contemporary romance. I have a penchant for writing characters over 40, over 50, if I can. I like, working the Gen X angle.
All right. And Scarlett?
Hello, I am Scarlett Peckham, broadcasting live from LA, where we are hurricane prepping, which is very weird to say. I write steamy historical romances set mostly in the Georgian era. Try to focus on strong, powerful women.
All right. And Matthew.
Hey, everybody. How's it going? Matthew Norman here. I'm the author of Charm City Rocks. I have this sitting right next to me, which is very helpful. I write just contemporary fiction, and this is my first crack at a love story / romance. And I learned the phrase closed door spice after this book came out. So there is sex, but you have to use your imagination. And I'm thrilled to be here. I'm coming to you from Delaware in the present.
Did you say in the present?
In the present, yes.
All right. So I see Karen said that she actually starts her novels with over 40, over 50. Those are the characters she writes for. But for the rest of you, did you know you were writing a romance for older protagonists? Is that what you set out to do? Let's start with LaQuette on that one.
Oh, absolutely. It's it's been over 20 years since I've been in my 20s, so it's really hard for me to reach back into that era and write characters who honestly would get on my nerves if they were real people acting that way. So I don't hang around a large amount of 20 somethings. So I wanted to write. The entire reason I write is to see myself on the page, because growing up I did not see curvy Black chicks from Brooklyn in Harlequin romances. So I decided I needed to write my own. And so every time I sit down to, open a book and with a fresh page, I'm looking to write myself or someone I know, put those experiences on the page. So yeah, it's as I'm over 40, my characters are creeping there too.
Matthew, what about you? Is this your first romance?
This is my first romance, and just kind of the mechanics of the book and the plot. I needed my characters to be kind of in act 2 of their lives and have the perspective to look back on act 1 of their lives. And so that's just sort of the mechanics of the book. But I think more importantly, I totally agree. I'm infinitely more interested in the complexities of being in my 40s than I am in looking back at what the complexities of my 20s were like. I think writing about a bunch of beautiful 20-year-olds right now would be like writing a period piece. I would have to research and go talk to those people and be like, how do you talk and what do you do and do you all meet online now? So it would be like writing historical fiction for me. And so absolutely, I was thrilled to be writing about people in their 40s and taking their second chance at the loves of their lives.
Karen?
Well, for me, I didn't write my first book until I was 40, and I was kind of spurred on by turning 40. And so I just wrote a 40-year-old heroine, and I didn't think anything about it. Even though I was a lifelong romance fan, I'd never really thought that much about the age of the characters. So I wrote a woman turning 40. And then when I tried to query that book, that was when I got my first kind of slap in the face, basically, about the stigma of age and romance. And I mean, that was 14 years ago.
Wow.
So yeah, but a lot of people just said to me, you can't write a romance about a woman who's 40. And you really can't write a romance about a woman who's 40 if there's sex in it. So yeah, I got 108 rejections on that book, I'm proud to say. But it did eventually come out, and it's one of my best, it's a book that brings a lot of readers to me. So, but I never set out to do it. It was just my own life situation. That was what resonated with me.
Thank you. By the way, I'm taking notes because I like to face my questions go by what you're talking about and what it seems to be like you're interested in. I have a set of questions, but I would prefer to just kind of build on whatever it is we're already talking about and interested in. So when you see me looking down, I'm just writing as fast as I can, whatever you're talking about. So let me go with Renee next.
I mean, look, I think every character choice is purposeful. So and age is a definite factor in that. But for me, look, I'm 45, divorced, kind of cynical about life at the moment. And I just think writing fresh-faced 20-year-olds would come across as really ungenuine because it'd be kind of snarky and they'd know too much about like red flags and what to watch for. And, you're too daft when you're 20 to see all of that. So I think the books I've been writing recently tend towards older characters just because they fit with where my head is at.
And Scarlett?
My latest series is about a group of 1790s feminists, like sort of modeled off of Mary Wollstonecraft, who are more mature women. They're all in their late 30s, because I thought the idea of people banding together to, fight for social justice and their rights was something that was more interesting if they were coming from like a history of years and years and years of being marginalized or having, you know, kind of paid the price for the ways in which they weren't getting a lot of say in their lives. And also, I write in the historical space, and I think partly for reasons of an earlier life expectancy, and partly because a lot of the books are sort of set in Regency England and a focus on the aristocracy, where there was a high premium on finding a wife who was, you know, around 18 to 20 years old from a very like wealthy, aristocratic high class family. And so a lot of those books sort of do focus on really young characters. And I was like, you know, I've written that kind of book too. I did with my first series, and I was like, let's get some like women my age on the page and just rock out with that, see what happens. So it was fun.
All right, so Scarlett, Matthew, and Karen. No, yeah, what are yours? Does your characters have some of your characters have kids, which is a whole different way of writing. I want to say, Matthew, you had the 18-year-old in there who does the scam, and Karen, yours was like the male character had kids in
Right.
that one, and then Scarlett, the male character in that one also in your book also had kids, the one I read. So talk about adding kids to this mix. Like, what does that do to an older character? And that way we'll have the other people talk about writing without kids. So where's the sex on the page or having the relationship? What does that look like when you throw kids into the mix? Anybody can start.
I'll go. For me, because I'm also a mom, I would say the best thing about kids is that they reflect a character in a way that other characters just can't. Your kids know you and you know your kids in a way that that relationship is not really replicable, I don't think, anywhere else in your life. So, and you have a weakness for your kids that you don't have for other people. And so for me, it's just all about emotion and love and that really like raw feeling. But I also think it taps into a lot of what makes it interesting when there's romance with older characters, because life is just more complex. You know, you can't just, you know, you meet someone and fall in love, but if they don't work in the scheme of your life, it's not going to happen. And your kids are part of the scheme of your life. So for me, that's what I like writing. I don't tend to write littler kids, because little kids are a boner killer, as my husband likes to say. So I have written some characters with little kids in like my Harlequin books, but I tend to do more. I love writing, you know, teenagers, and because they will push back in a way that, you know, a 4-year-old won't.
Scarlett, go ahead, like, because you had younger kids in yours.
Oh, yeah, in my first book, which I have a lovely copy of here, The Rakess, in this series, there's a bit of motherhood is definitely a big theme in the book, you know, because that was such a central role in women's lives. And the heroine of the book doesn't really aspire to be a mother. And the hero of the book is a father of 2 pretty young kids. Like, I think, I can't quite remember their ages. I think they're 3 and 7. So I thought it would be interesting to establish tension between the male protagonist, who's a single father and whose life really revolves around protecting his children, and a woman who is not a maternal figure and who has a very scandalous reputation as a firebrand intellectual, who has a very active sex life that the whole country knows about. So I don't know, I just kind of wanted to smash that up and kind of play with the dynamics of like, how do you build a family or build a romantic connection when the circumstances don't line up exactly in a way that might be seem to be like ideal.
Go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, I think both of those comments really resonate with me. You know, and like Karen said, it's about the complexity of being in the second act of your life, and often that comes with kids. I've written young kids usually just for sort of comedic value, because little kids can be funny. But in this book, my main character has an 18-year-old And my main male character has an 18-year-old, and my main female character has about a 22-year-old. I don't think I ever gave her an actual age, but I got some writing advice early on. The number one way to make your characters as sympathetic as possible is to show the reader something that they love. And what is more obvious than children? Because good people love their children, bad people love their children, complex people love their children, emotionally messed up people love their children. And so it's a great way to humanize and gain sympathy for your characters and show them the thing that they love more than anything else, and that is probably their kids.
Because yours centers more around the male character, Matthew, with the single father, and Scarlett also has a single father, although his kids are a lot younger. Talk about, why did you choose to make the kid that age? Why? What helped write the story by having this be an 18-year-old as opposed to a 7-year-old?
Right. So my main character, Billy, I needed his life to be shaken up because I think he's 41 in the book. And for his entire adulthood, he's drawn a very small circle around his life in Baltimore and lived in that circle very happily. But I needed to jar him out of that. And so his son, Caleb, who shared custody with his ex, Robin, his ex-partner, Robin, they were never married, they co-parent. And I wanted to shake up his life by having Caleb going off to college. So he's a senior in high school. He's wrapping up his senior year when the book starts. And that sort of throws his life into a bit of a tailspin because he's about to have a huge change. And Caleb is motivated in going off to college. He's actually worried about his dad because Caleb is sophisticated enough as a young, an 18-year-old to know that his dad has maybe cobbled together a sort of happiness that maybe can't survive without him being there and so close in his life. And so he does something that brings a possible relationship into his dad's life. And it's kind of the jumping off point for the book, really.
Look, what your character was divorced, but no kids, and no kids for either either main character. Why did you make that choice?
I don't like myself personally being pigeonholed into one thing, right? Like you can only be one thing. And so particularly when I'm writing, my heroines who are always Black women, I strive to write characters who are always different, who don't fit the mold, right? So I do have characters who have children, but I also wanted to write characters because in romance, having a 40-year-old divorced woman find romance is just pretty much unheard of in romance. It happens so very rare and so very rarely. And so I really wanted to be able to show that, I know plenty of friends that I have who don't have children, who aren't married or are either divorced, and they're living their best lives since they're divorced. And so I was seeing a lot of rom-coms that were based on the cute little 20-year-old, the ingenue. And I was just like, why can't we have funny moments like this of an older woman falling in love, of an older man falling in love? Because, falling in love can be really funny, when you're looking at it from the outside in. So I wanted to write a story that focused on the same sort of rom-com-y situations, but with protagonists who had experienced life. So a lot of the struggles they were having weren't based on the fact that they just had no life experience. It was because they were evolved. And for, Vanessa, she's trying to reinvent herself, re-evolve, create, discover who she is all over again now that her situation has changed. And so, I wanted people to know that Black women in their 40s, we reinvent ourselves all the time, whether we go back to school, whether we, are divorced and are now putting ourselves back on the market, whatever our situation, we reinvent ourselves all the time. And so it was fun to write a character who represented that.
Yeah, and
Thank
look,
you.
kids can add comedy sometimes, right? Like in my novella Count Me In, I've got a Sierra is a retired rock star. So she was a big rock star in the 90s, and now this was written early pandemic, so 2021-ish, I think I wrote it. And she's coming off sobriety, and she works as a courier driver, and the other main character is a woman who's just gone through a bit of an ugly divorce and has kind of a bisexual awakening, but she's got this lesbian daughter who's in her 20s. And so of course when she's like, oh, I've got feelings for my courier driver, and she rings her lesbian daughter, and they have this hilarious conversation about sex and lesbian sex, and and I think that there's that niceness of the parent-child relationship when they both become adults, being able to talk about issues like that, and that kind of twist on the daughter who's in a loving relationship giving advice to her mum is just comedic and and sweet as well.
So Renee, one of the books I read of yours, I'm speaking of lesbian sex. So one of the books I read The Show Queen, I think it's called.
Okay.
And she, speaking of the pandemic, because this is after the pandemic and they've got money, but somebody buys the building. So looking at gentrification in your story, and a little bit of that also in Matthew's as well, gentrification in that one. That's why you got to move. He's got to move somewhere else because they need his apartment for a coffee shop. So talk about what's happening in the world. You said you wrote some stuff during the pandemic. Did all of you write your books during the pandemic? I read different ones, so I don't know. So
Yeah,
talk
I
about
wrote
that.
books during the pandemic, but not. I believe Vanessa was done either before or was happening. Some part of it toward the end was happening during the pandemic.
How did the pandemic and people just lives are different now after the pandemic, at least for some people, especially as a business owner. A lot of businesses did not reopen after the pandemic. How does this affect you in your writing? And was there any changes you had to make, or what does that look like for you?
I mean, for me, I'm a mom of smallish kids. And so at the time, my kids were really small. They were in school 6 hours a day. So I could write a book, a full novel, probably in about 8 weeks. And it was, cranking out the words every day. And then the pandemic happened, and I could barely get a single book together in 4 months. Because it's different when your kids are home all day long. And I discovered at that point that, as terrible as this may sound, I am not a mother that needs to be in my children's faces 24/7 a day. I've discovered that during the pandemic, and it negatively impacted my productivity as a writer. As for what I was actually writing, I absolutely refused to include the pandemic in the worlds that I was creating. The reason I read and write romance is for escapism. I want to sort of remove myself from all the things that we have to deal with as adults. And I didn't want to write about what was such a heavy topic, something that we were all, regardless of how we were impacted, we all came out of that experience changed. And for me, I mean, I don't knock anyone else that chooses otherwise. That's, everyone to each their own. But for me, especially with Vanessa, getting to write, this is a fun, sexy cover. And I really wanted to focus on things that were fun and sexy, and not my, at the time, 10 and 8-year-old asking me where the snacks were, or bothering me because they, he stole my this, or he looked at me, or he breathed on me the wrong way. I didn't want to have to think about that in the worlds I was creating. So,
my teacher wants my video on during Zoom, but I haven't cleaned my room, and I don't want my friends to see that I'm still in my pajamas.
For me, emotionally, it was really it was just so heavy to deal with. So to have to write that too into a book wasn't something I had the emotional spoons to be able to deal with. And I think anyone on this panel will tell you, when you're writing, you are very much dealing with the heavy emotions of your characters. And it was just too much to have to deal with that in the real world, and then have to deal with the trauma of my my characters as well.
I'm incredibly
Anyone
impressed
else?
you managed to write books in 4 months with all that going on. I think I took like 2 years to write my pandemic book. I was just like, I can't concentrate. I'm
That 4 months, because that it was mostly already written before
Oh.
the pandemic, and then I had to like finish it up. So it's still like my productivity still has not caught up to what it was. And the kids have been back to school for probably a year and a half now. That it I mean, we're all learning to deal in this new world post pandemic. So it is what it is. They get it when they get it.
Yeah, we think about the pandemic as being, when I think about the pandemic, I think about right at the beginning when we were all frightened and we were all huddled together like we were living in bomb shelters. And we like, should I spray my bananas with Lysol? We were like in that stage. And that was like a total work stoppage for me because I was worried about the kids. The kids were, you know, kind of in my face. I was helping them manage online school. Suddenly I was my household's IT person, you know, which wasn't great. But as we settled into the pandemic, you know, which went on and on and on, I was lucky that my kids were a little older, not like grown up by any means, but they were a little older, so they didn't need me as much. And I kind of eased into just sort of a workflow. And I basically wrote and published 2 books during the pandemic. And I agree, neither of them, I just ignore the pandemic in both of those worlds that I created, because they just, I feel like if you mention the pandemic, it's suddenly a pandemic book, really. And I just didn't want to do that. So I escaped for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of went the opposite way, I guess. Like, I wrote the Rockstar series of novellas set right in the early part of the pandemic, and it's set in Australia, so it's very like the experience that I was having. And then I wrote the Burlesque series, which Show Queen, which Kathleen mentioned, kind of set in a post-pandemic, everybody's vaccinated fantasy.
Yeah.
Where we all just go back about our normal lives and COVID disappears, and it doesn't become like, you know, now obviously it's still around and it's part of the conversation, but in those books I deliberately made it like magically go away. And then because then I could talk about the impacts that the shutdowns had on the characters, and because it was set in a burlesque club that had to kind of hustle during the pandemic to stay afloat as a business, that it was that business side of it that I found fascinating for that series. And it's set around this kind of, yeah, and I say that in the forward at the start of the book, that it's sort of a, you know, fantasy setting in a way.
All right, let's talk about sex, because I know that's what most people have tuned in. So we can talk about sex with older characters. A couple of you have said, you know, I write steamy. Matthew does the fade to black. I mean, how do you make these choices of how much sex you're going to put on the page in these books? Like, from, we have extremes of this, but we go from here to here in this panel. So talk about how you decide. How do you decide how much sex to include?
I mean, open door sex is always a thing for me in my books. I don't write closed door sex at all. How graphic the sex gets can depend on a couple of things. Because I tend to go for the I'd rather apologize than ask for permission sort of situation. So I write what I want, and then I wait for my editors to say, hey, this is a bit much for our readers. So like books like my Harlequin books, although they are open door sex in comparison to my my St. Martin's Press books and my rom-coms, my trade books, those books are a lot hotter than my Harlequin books might be, because it's a different readership. And it's marketed to people differently. Some of my self-published books are definitely probably the hottest thing that I've created. I thought the sex in Vanessa Jarrett was steamy, but I've, you know, had people tell me it was really hot for a rom-com. But it really just, my my go-to is always is make it as hot as I can. And then if my editor says too hot to handle, I'll try to like calm it down a little bit. But I do try to like get away with certain things, like certain usages of words. Like in Harlequin, I was really surprised they let me get away with one of the characters was it was basically like the black moment. One of them discovered the hero discovers the heroine lied about something, and when he asks her why, her excuse is basically, well, the sex was so good and I just kind of forgot. And his response was, are you really trying to tell me I dickmatized you? Like, is that really what you're saying to me? That's the argument. That's the defense in this situation. And I really didn't think that Harlequin was going to let me put that in there, but they did. I got away with it. So
For me, it's all about the tone of the book, because some books are more emotional. Other books are more light and fun. And so for me, if I'm writing a light and fun book, then the sex probably isn't going to be as hot because I'm going to try to put in some sort of light, fun, sarcastic, terrible moments, awkward. There's nothing better than awkward sex, right? So, and then, I deal with a lot of the same, because I also write for Harlequin. So, it's the same thing, just trying to, it's very much reader expectations. The readers expect this, and you better write this. It is a little different with older characters. I have a book coming out next month where the heroine is 42 and the hero is 28. So that was a little, but that was, it was only different really in terms of like her internal thoughts about, can I keep up with him? Do I want to keep up with him? Things like that.
My books are pretty thematically about sex, not about sex. Like I have my first series, which is called The Secrets of Charlotte Street, is called that because it is about a whipping house in 1750s England and secret sex club. So a lot of the plot lines and like tension in those stories is about what we choose to reveal about ourselves publicly, and what we do behind the scenes, and what is sexual expression in an era where there's certain expectations around feminine behavior, all of that. And then my second series, The Society of Sirens, is really about women who have incredibly scandalous reputations, like so-called fallen women or prostitutes, or who band together to sort of create this movement. And so they are weaponizing their sexual reputations because people love a sex scandal. So the heroine of The Rakes is a radical memoirist who is revealing secrets about trauma that happened to her in her younger years, because people consider her this like horrible slut, and truly villainize her for her past. So she's like, okay, you're fascinated by horrible sluts, well, here you go. So in those books, like writing open door sex and being pretty frank about what's happening and how it's happening, it's really, really tied to character development. And I don't know, I also just think it's fun. I enjoy a steamy sex scene. So
yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like a lot of it, I think, comes down to author branding as well. Like you write at the level of heat that you're comfortable with, but sometimes it can be quite hilarious. Like I got asked by Harlequin Australia to write a couple of novellas for a Christmas series that they were doing, a multi-author Christmas series. And the editor was like, yeah, okay, so this is closed door. So I was like, oh, well, I've never done one of them before, but I'll have a crack. And I wrote this, and like they were fun to write. They're actually re-releasing the whole series next month, which is nice because they've been around for a while. And anyway, the bit that made me laugh was that when I submitted it, the editor was like, "Oh, this is very sensual." Well, You take someone who writes a lot of sex and you tell them not to, where else am I going to go with that?
I think with my books, this is my fifth novel, and I think all of my this is the most closed door. My door has been cracked slightly more open than some of my other books, but in the interest of being honest, I feel like self-consciousness is a bad thing for writers. I think we can all agree to that. But as I've gotten older, I have become more self-conscious about sex in my writing, frankly, because I understand that the vast majority of my readership is female. That's a documentable fact, right? And I am self-conscious about a female's reaction to me, a man, writing a bunch of sex, to be honest. And no one's ever told me to be self-conscious about it. My editor has never said more or less sex, whatever. I've just written to my own comfort level, like you just said. But I do admit that I have allowed voices to get in my head a little bit. And I've had this sort of female reader on my shoulder being like, I don't know if you can write that. I don't know if we want you to write that. And I'm a little shy about admitting that, because self-consciousness is not a great place to be as a writer. But about this topic, I would have to admit that I am a bit,
So next time you sit down to write that, I want you to shut that person off, like just turn the volume down and write whatever you want. That's what beta readers are for. That's what editors are for. But if you want to try, I'm not saying that you have to write more sex if you don't want to, but if it's something you're interested in attempting, just shut off your inner critic and, do what you want to do.
You're right. It could be fun. I could have you as the voice writer on my show. It sounds like a good time. I want to write that book.
I mean, I think it does raise an interesting question about what you feel like you're allowed to write. Mm-hmm. Certainly, when I wrote my first sapphic character, I was still in a relationship with a man. And even though I was bisexual and had a very odd relationship with a woman when I was in my early 20s, I still had that doubt of, am I the right person to write this sapphic romance? But of course I am, right? Like, and now that I'm divorced and single and having my best life, flirting with lots of people of all genders, I look back on that internal voice and I think, well, that was silly of me. Of course, I was always that person, and I could have written that without the doubt, right? But I think doubt it's good and bad, right? Like, it's bad if it stops you from writing something that's natural to you, but it's also good to keep asking those questions. Am I the right person to write this character? Just because I've had this idea, does it mean that I should write, for me, should I write a Black character? Should I write a disabled character? Right? Like, those are good questions to be asking yourself as a writer anyway. It's just, where is that line between what is is this something I should be investigating and thinking about, or is this just self-doubt?
It's very I mean, no doubt things are very much there's always that little thin line between falling off one edge or the other. But I think in terms of writing, I think there's a difference in terms of writing like sex between, sex in a book versus identities, right? So where Matthew was talking about, he's a man who, men have sex. He has a bit of experience to really draw from his own perspective, if any, to sort of bring that out there and put that out into the world. And again, there are beta readers and editors to sort of say, hey, here are some things you might want to be cautious of, or things you might want to pull back on, or here, this, that, and the third. But I think when we're writing about identities, it becomes a little bit, dicey, because there's a lot of social issues that are attached to identity. And so you have to ask yourself, in my opinion, am I writing this to normalize the presence of this identity on the page? Or am I writing this to explain what it is to be this identity? And I think those are two totally separate things, right? I write male romance. I am not a gay man, but I don't write male romance that focuses on what it is to be gay. I write male romances that normalize the presence of gay men, especially gay Black men, on the page for mainstream readers who may not, who because they do not subscribe to, they're not a part of that community, they may not even know that that sort of book is a book they wanted to read. And that's my lane that I've chosen. But I would never attempt to write a book about what the Black gay experience is, because that's not something that I have any clue how to write, if that makes any sense from my perspective.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say, but much better said.
Okay, so romance is having a good moment right now. I know somebody who just opened their second romance themed bookstore. Like it is just growing. And in our store, and my store is very tiny, but that's like a big seller for us, mostly because I love romance and I buy the books. And so, of course, that's what's going to sell because that's what I'm going to talk about. Do you feel, are you getting publishers asking you, write this book, write this romance? I think somebody put in there, are you seeing publishing romance with 40 and 50-year-old characters? Are you being asked about that? If there's more interest, are publishers asking you to write this? Make your characters older because that's what's happening. How's that looking for you with your next projects coming up? How do you decide what you're doing there?
I mean, I'll just say that, my best-selling indie book, Gray Hair Don't Care, came out in what year is it? 2021. And that book did amazingly for me. It sold really great, got a starred review in Publishers Weekly, starred review from the Library Journal. I mean, amazing. And my agent went right out on, trying to pitch and sell a proposal I wrote for another contemporary romance with a heroine who was 50, and it was crickets. It wasn't even like, nope. So I would say no, unfortunately, that I don't think there is more interest. Harlequin did, for this last book, the book that's coming out next month, they did specifically ask me to write an older heroine, but they wanted a younger man. They did not want a 40-year-old couple. They wanted a 40-year-old woman and a much younger man. So, I think we get some lip service, but I still feel like in general, if the age issue is going to be in any way center stage, the trad publishers are still shying away from it. They might sneak it in. It might be okay with them if the overriding hook of the book is big enough to kind of sell it on its own, then they probably would, but they definitely don't want it to be center stage. That's my experience.
I agree. I mean, I've never had anyone ask me to write an older set of characters. I just usually kind of do what I want and see what happens. But I don't see enough of it like in mainstream book distribution, right? So I think if you go into indie publishing more, it's definitely more readily available maybe in the indie space, because indies developmentally don't really have to consider whether they want to, age groups and things like that. They just write what they want to write, what they know that their audience is looking for. With traditional publishing, they really can get stuck on that little 20-something-year-old young white woman who is new to the world and discovering the world, and this big strong usually white man comes along and saves her from the world and makes everything perfect. That is the story that we're seeing over and over and over again. And so when you get those of us like, you get authors like us who are disrupting that, it's not something that I think is necessarily a movement, like a collective movement, but I do feel like authors are not just wanting to write more of these books, but I think readers are starting to say, hey, like, I'm tired of reading about 20 somethings. Like we're on the 30-year-olds and the 40-year-olds and the 50-year-olds. Like where are these people, who are, who are falling in love? I don't just want to read about, because at this age, someone in their 20s is a child to me, and I don't want to read. Like for my own enjoyment, I'm not looking to make that my full, every romance I read is about a 20 something year old. So I think it's an individual choice for authors. I think it's definitely something we would see more of in the indie space, but in the traditional space, I don't think it's quite caught on yet, as Karen mentioned.
I think that's
Yeah, someone in the Q&A asked about characters over 60, and I think I've only read one book with characters over 60, which would be Courtney Milan's whatever it's called, Mrs. Martin something.
Yep.
Adventure.
I've read a few, but not a lot.
I do find that it's readers who really have an appetite for older characters, at least in my experience. Like I get, emails and DMs all the time asking about certain people who pop up, like, will that person get their own book? Or would you write someone in their 30s or 40s, like when I hadn't yet? I certainly have never been asked those questions by a publisher. Which is not to say that there isn't a market for it, I guess, but I think what we're all saying is there isn't a market for it. And that's not, that doesn't reflect the actual appetites of the readership of romance, or any genre, I think.
I think it's not that there's not a market. It's just like when they weren't writing books with Black characters or having Black characters on the cover, they were saying they wouldn't sell. What they weren't doing is putting the marketing behind it. People wanted them. They just couldn't get them because they weren't publishing them. So I would think this would be the same thing. As people would want it. As a matter of fact, I'm almost 60. I'm 57 years old. It's like, but almost all romances are like what LaQuette said, and it's not because we don't want them, it's because they're not publishing them, and they publishers tend to stick as long as they can with the same thing that's selling money. So you'll have 8 books that are exactly the same book with a different cover, and the girl's name is just changed and the guy's name is changed, but everything else is the same because they're going to keep going until they stop making money on that one before they move to the next one. I will say, I think I talked to Billy. It was hard for me to find some of your books, and that was just like amazing to me. I'm like, well, that's ridiculous. We're doing this panel. These books are out there. They're just not getting the books. My other big one that I can't find right now is, traditionally published Native American Indigenous romance. So hard to find. So
Constance
hard.
Gilliam. She has an entire series that's based.
Name again?
Constance Gilliam. Absolutely love her series. It's an interracial story between a Native American man and an African American woman, but it takes place on a reservation, and it's so beautiful. I mean, the research that she put into that series, I can't think of it off the top of my head. I think it's the Lakota, something to do with Lakota in the title of the series. But it's beautiful, and you're right, we don't see nearly enough stories that feature Native American protagonists.
Who's spending the money too? Matthew, you talked about, women are reading your books. Like we can look at insights, we can look at all of this and know who's reading the books. Like I know who's following my channel on Instagram, all of that. And by my experience in our store, it's older people who are buying these romances. It's not really the college students or anybody that age who are actually buying those. And so like who's reading your books? Who reads your books? Who buys your books? And do you look at that and then try to make the story reflect that? Or do you just write what you are thinking that's in your head you need to write? How does that work for you? Does it go back and forth? What are we doing?
For me, I just kind of write the stories that present themselves to me, and hope for the best after that. I bet a lot of writers kind of say that. Writers who have a really good business sense and a market sense are maybe more directive in their creativity. But for me, the stories arrive and I write them and I give them to my agent and I just hope for the best,
Audio.
3 years and I'm still staying on mute and talking. We have a question from the audience that says they want advice for writing a romance novel if one has zero experience writing fiction.
Just start.
Yeah.
Everyone had to
Do it.
start somewhere one day.
Yeah.
I wrote
think-
nonfiction for 10 years before I wrote fiction, and I just started. And you'll figure it out as you go, like the rest of us have.
I also think you internalize so much about story structure just from reading, watching TV, watching movies. Just do it. Don't think too hard about it, because you know what? I would give anything to go back to writing my first book when it felt like just pure inspiration and there were zero expectations and I didn't have to please anybody other than myself. That was an amazing experience that I will never get back. So I say just do it.
Don't let yourself feel stymied if you don't feel like you're initially good at it. Like, I've written a lot of books at this point, and my first drafts are still like things that no one should ever have to read, including me. It's torture. So, writing is a process, even if you're very experienced. And I agree, like, just have to start and keep going. And then once you've got a draft or part of one, read it again and keep going.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think the biggest gift you can give yourself when you're trying to write your first novel or your 25th novel is to allow yourself to write badly, allow yourself to write imperfect sentences, because the key is momentum. Because you've written, or you've read 1,000 books, and all of those books you have read are the final draft, the published draft of those books. But if you list your 10 favorite books right now in your head, your 10 favorite novels or memoirs or whatever, there was a point in the process of writing all of those books in which those books were a disaster, in which there were giant gaps, in which the dialogue was bad and all the characters sounded the same. It's a process, and writing is about rewriting. So be excited, just sit down and do it, and write that first draft as quickly as you can, and then just chip away at it.
Yeah, look, nobody is good at anything that they start new. When you don't learn to catch a ball without dropping a few, you don't learn to paint a picture without first doing terrible stick figures, right? It's everything that you start new is going to be kind of bad because you need to practice. So you just have to start.
Even when you have the practice, it's still going to be bad. I'm working on revisions on a book right now that I want to stab my characters. I have I hate this draft, and I don't care what I do, it doesn't seem to get better. Eventually my editor and I will figure it out, but it's a process every time with every single book. So don't get wrapped up in. There are times that I even surprise myself where I feel like I suck at this. Like, what am I doing? And then I'll sit down and write something and leave it alone and come back to it maybe a week or two later. And it's like, well, damn, that's kind of good. I actually might know what I'm doing. Like, wow. Oh,
yeah, who wrote that? Was that me?
It's almost like there's a disconnect between, it really is very automatic. The way you engage with writing, and during those times when I feel like I hate when I feel like I don't have the skill to write, I read. And doing that, consuming romance, makes it easier. I think I'm sort of storing all of that until it fills my well, and then I can go back and actually create for myself. So, don't get so wrapped up in creating a brilliant first draft. No one should publish a first draft. It really is never going to be that good. And again, as Matthew was saying, it's never going to be perfect. The amount of run-on sentences, like, I don't even care anymore. I just tell my editors, do what you got to do, because you know what you're getting from me. We'll make it better together. But I didn't really care about where that comma went when I was writing this story. So don't worry about it, just write.
Tell me a little bit. We only have a few minutes. You have 6 minutes. And in that 6 minutes, I first want you to tell me what your writing process is. Like, especially, are you a full-time writer? And then what does your day look like? And then second, I need you to tell me 2 books I should be reading right now. So whoever wants to go first.
Oh, look, everybody looks away.
It's
No
like,
one wants to
oh
go
no,
first.
I didn't know we were gonna have to do this.
This is homework. You didn't tell us that this was part of the
But
assignment.
really, come on, read. Okay, tell me 2 books I should be reading is not homework. You know, every virtual event ends with tell me something I should be reading, or who's your favorite author, or what do you have coming out next. And I think most of you mentioned what you have coming out next. So then I need to you need to tell me who you love. What should I be reading?
I
And just kind of
love
for people who like writing, what's that kind of look like for you?
I love Naima Simone. I don't think she's ever written a bad book.
No.
Everything Naima writes, I'm here for. I am currently reading Aaliyah Burke's Rock Hill's Fall series, which is so hilarious. What else did I just read? Melanie Harlow is killing it with the rom-coms right now for me. She just had a release like at the beginning of August, and I'm a little perturbed because it's not in audio yet. And I've, COVID made me switch over from like reading with a physical book to audio. My brain just doesn't work that way anymore. So I'm killing for this book to come out. But yeah, those are the people that I'm reading right now. My next book is Secret Air for Christmas. And it's a male romance, and it's for Harlequin Desire. It comes out in October, and I'm actually going to be at the Ripped Bodice celebrating it toward the end of October. We're putting the details of that together.
Awesome.
Renee, you want to jump in? What should I be reading?
Sure, since I made the joke. So I just read Rachel Reed's new book, which is called A Time to Shine, which I really loved. I think it comes out soon. And I'm really looking forward to Carmen Lee's Sapphic bowling book. I can't remember what it's called. Like, she's in the same writer Zoom as me, and so I've like listened to her like talk about writing this book for so long. I'm like, oh my god, I have to read this book, but now I can't remember its title.
Karen?
So that comes out soon. Carmen Lee with a K for Carmen.
Got it.
What else have I been reading lately? I've been reading a lot of nonfiction for my day job, so everything is a bit I don't know, my brain is a bit haywire at the moment. So how about let's talk about writing process. I basically have 2 day jobs. So the one is 20 hours a week that is work from home, and it's fairly flexible, though it's mostly Wednesday, Thursday. And the other one is freelance writer for a couple of magazines. So that's one is like daily news every day. So that's quite straightforward. It's just an hour or 2 at lunchtime. But the other one is really erratic because it's about 8 to 10 issues a year. So we have like at the moment we've had 3 weeks of nothing, and then there'll be 2 to 3 weeks of like, here, write 10 800-word articles.
Oh wow.
And interview all these people. So the managing that and managing my books on top of that is sort of chaotic, and every day looks different. But I do try and get up and knock out maybe 500 words just after breakfast, and then go and do all my day job stuff, and then have another writing session. I do online Zoom sprints with the word makers, which is around lunchtime, just after lunch, my time zone. So that kind of fits in well, and I can do 2 or 3 40-minute sprints with them, which I try to go to every day, but I just, with juggling all my day jobs and everything, is tricky. And then in terms of actual writing, I write in layers. So I write all the dialogue first, and then I come back and add the emotions, and then I basically do that for the first draft and sort of cycles through the chapters. And then I let it rest for about a month, and then I come back and add in all the description as a 3rd layer later, because that's the bit that I really struggle with. So I leave it. So it's a future me's problem.
You're already in the future, so it's your problem now. All right, Karen, what about you? What do you recommend?
Well, actually, I think Adele Buck is still one of our little attendees. I just read a book by Adele Buck that comes out in April. It's for the new Harlequin imprint Afterglow, which I'm also writing for, and it's called Fake Flame. And it's got an academic heroine who's very cynical about love, and I don't know. I love grumpy heroines. So that was really fun. It's called Fake Flame, comes out in April. The other book I'm reading, I read a lot of craft books, and I'm also writing my first screenplay right now. And so I'm reading books about writing screenplays. My next release is the September book. It's called Their After Hours Playbook. It's about two competing sports agents, and that's the older woman, younger man book. And that's my final book for Harlequin Desire. So, but I'll be writing for Afterglow, which is this new, very exciting imprint. And as far as process goes, I do write full time. I try to get as much writing done before noon as humanly possible, because the afternoons are for revising and polishing. So I get up really early, like 5:30, write as fast as possible, and then revise in the afternoons.
Scarlett, what about you? What do you recommend we read?
I have been reading tons of rom-coms lately. My next book is actually a rom-com. And I loved Romantic Comedy by Curtis Sittenfeld. It just like hit all of my romance notes so well, in unexpected ways. Like it's a COVID book, and the way that she handles COVID in the love story is just like, wow, it's so beautifully done. And then I am a huge stan for Abby Jimenez. Her last book, Yours Truly, like, just, I laugh and I cry. Literally, that doesn't happen that often. So those would be my two recs. And I do write full time. I have an indie series and I have my historical series. And then now, under a different pen name, Caitlin Doyle, I have a rom-com like contract coming out. So I find that it's incredibly helpful to just always be staggering deadlines. So I'll like draft one book when I have a break from editing another book, and then I'll like return to reading something while getting copy edits, and it keeps me honest. Without a deadline, I can be a bit hopeless.
Matthew, what about you? Your last one. Tell me two books I should be reading, and then a little bit about your process, and then we're out of here.
So we're out of here. My favorite phenomenon ever, and I've witnessed it 1,000 times, and I've experienced it 1,000 times, is when you ask a bunch of writers to recommend a book, it's as if we have never read a book in our lives.
It is amazing to me. It's amazing.
I was
you always
frantic.
say read to write, and then it's like, what am I reading?
What am I reading? Score one also for Romantic Comedy by Curtis Sittenfeld. I loved it. It was a bit of a departure for her. I thought it was fantastic. The way it handled COVID also was just really good, and it was a very sexy book too, I thought. I'm also reading Richard Russo's newest book right now. I love Richard Russo. He's a pub day purchase for me, and it's not a romance at all. It's just classic, just kind of literary fiction. But my process is I am a full-time writer. I'm fortunate enough to be able to do that, and it's fantastic. And I have two kids. Summers are a little wild because the kids are off. One of them just wandered by a minute ago. But during the school year in particular is when I'm most regimented. I get them to school. I maybe have a workout, and then I write until it's time to pick them up. And I try to do between 1,000 and 1,200 words a day when I'm in first draft mode. And that's considered a good day for me. And then in the editing mode, it's harder to quantify what a good and a bad day is too. It just depends on how much caffeine I've had, I guess. But yeah, so that's my process.
Thank you all. That was really fantastic. It really went quickly too. That was as fast as hour I've spent on Zoom in a very long time. So I appreciate you taking the time to hang out with us. I'm going to hand this back over to Bookstore Romance Day. Is it Billy or Emily here? One of those will close us out, and then we'll be done.
Hi, everybody. This is Billy again. I just want to thank you all for coming and remind you that you can purchase all of the author's books from the Brain Layer. Link is several places in the comments because I'm that girl. There's also a playlist of audiobooks if you're an audiobook person available on Libro FM. That link has also been dropped in the chat. And everybody who registered for this event will be entered into a drawing to win a box of books from the panelists, as well as some extra little surprise goodies. Thank you all. This is the end of today. We have more great panels tomorrow, and hope to see some of you there. And if not, thank you all so much, and we hope to see you next year. Bye.
Bye.